Good morning, everybody. I think we have a critical mass, so let's get started for the session, Understanding Child-Only Units. I'd like to give you all a hearty welcome, especially this early in the morning. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to extend a very big thank you to HHS, ACF, and OPRE, and to our very excellent panel, and also to the audience, both in person and following along live stream. My name is David Kasabian. I'm a research associate at the Urban Institute here in DC, and I focus on TANF issues myself. But I don't want to talk too much about myself. I'd like to introduce what an excellent panel we have. We have Rachel Spiegelman with the Child and Family Policy Institute of California. We have Jane Malden with the University of California, Berkeley. And then wrapping up our panel is Todd Bland with the California Department of Social Services. And before I yield to them, I would just like to give a very, very brief overview of TANF child-only cases, and also share with you some what I think is very exciting new information that the project that I work on, the Welfare Rules Database, is expanding in this area. So I think this can be viewed as sometimes a very challenging topic. Sometimes Byzantine, but I think part of that is just due to the relatively short attention to detail in the research literature that we're starting to see changing very recently, and that's really exciting. So in talking about the types of TANF child-only cases, there are two very broad categories: non-parental cases, which, as the name suggests, means that there is no parent in the household, and then also parental cases, in which case there is a parent in the household, but for whatever reason they do not qualify for non-financial reasons. In non-parental cases, these typically arise in situations of serious parental problems, and states have the ability, of course, to customize or set the policy in their programs to determine under which circumstances children's caregivers can be eligible for TANF, whether to include a caregiver's income and resources, and who is included in the assistance unit. Speaking first about parental cases, there are three primary causes. The first is receipt of a supplemental security income, or SSI. The second is due to immigration status, and the third is due to other program rules that remove the parent from the unit. Just very, very briefly on SSI receipt, not to steal Richard's thunder. SSI, of course, is a federal benefit for low-income elderly persons and persons with severe disabilities, and in general, parents with SSI benefits are ineligible for TANF, but they themselves may apply for child-only benefits without having their income counted against the unit. Speaking really briefly on immigrant status, the shift to TANF barred many authorized immigrants from receiving federal benefits, and of course it is up to states whether to provide state-funded benefits or federal benefits to eligible non-citizens. At the focus here are citizen children whose parents are not eligible due to citizen status. Either their parents are in the country illegally, or the parent is qualified but is subject to the 5-year ban. And then other ineligible parents. These folks may have lost eligibility due to welfare fraud or a drug conviction. They may have been sanctioned for noncompliance of activity requirements or other behavioral requirements. And finally, there's also, if you were to exceed a time limit in a state that does not remove the needs of the child from a unit before the unit has hit the 60-month federal lifetime limit on receipt. Very briefly on why I think this is important, and this probably is no surprise. There's been a steadily growing percentage of the caseload that is comprised of child-only units. during the early years of TANF, these units comprised the mid-teens in percentage, about 15%, and in recent years they've now grown to almost half, or about 4 in 10. And even though the absolute number of these units has only grown marginally, their share in the caseload has really grown substantially. And intrinsically, these cases are more likely to have special considerations just by nature of how they've developed. Before turning it over, I just want to give a quick plug to several new policy tables that will be part of the project that I manage, the Welfare Rules Database. Really quickly, it is the official source of state TANF rules for the government. It is a longitudinal database that spans from 96 to the present, but we're always a year behind, so we're working the past year's data right now. And we will have 6 new tables in our annual publication, the Welfare Rules Database, that relate to child-only and non-parent caretaker units. And also underlying data in the database that is available online. You can find us just by going to your preferred web browser and typing in Welfare Rules Database. But specifically, we'll be including more information on our children living with non-relative caretakers potentially eligible, when a non-parent caretaker must be included or excluded from the unit, the treatment of income and assets of non-parent caretaker units, inclusion of SSI recipients in the unit, maximum child-only monthly benefits, the dollar level, and also work-related activity requirements for non-parent caretakers. And I know that there's a lot of gaps, or at least a number of gaps in the existing information available, and I hope that this new information, which should be released either in the late summer or early fall, and is a OPRE ASPE funded project, this can at least help fill in some of those gaps. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Richard as our first speaker, and we'll have a brief question and answer period at the end, so thank you all very much.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today on this topic. I have to remember to press this button, I guess. I and my colleague Jane Mullen are largely speaking from a report that came out in December 2012 called TANF Child-Only Cases. Who are they? What policies affect them? What is being done? This tells you how to find it. You can Google it. You can whatever. I don't think it's hard to find either on the Urban Institute website or the Child and Family Policy Institute of California website. And we'd like to express our thanks for financial support to OPRE and to ASPE, who jointly supported this project. So this morning I want to say a little bit about the background, and thank you, David, for getting us started. I think that was really a good warm-up. A little bit about the research that Jane and I and other colleagues pursued. And then I want to talk more about the SSI child-only cases, the triple burden that those cases experience, a little bit about retention rates among the SSI-Parent child-only cases, take-up by state policy, a little bit about transitions from TANF to SSI, and then I want to sort of summarize with an overview of the findings, talk about possible policy goals for this group of people, and a little bit about program considerations. And if I don't get to the end of my talk, the last several slides on program considerations, I feel like the handout will speak for itself. If you are not at a table that has one, there are a few still strewn around. So this is a graph that, at least to me, and I think to my colleague Jane, is sort of embedded in our brains, and probably many of you have seen it as well. The red cases, or the red bars, are those of adult-aided cases over time, and I guess they're blue are the child-only cases. And what the story that's here is that after Aurora, after TANF was invented, the number of adult cases dropped hugely. The number of child-only cases dropped a little bit, recovered a little bit, and then has stayed remarkably stable for the last 10 or so years. So on this slide, I think it was 1998 it is, that child-only cases were about 25% of TANF cases nationally, and it then went up to almost 50%, and it is now hovering somewhere around 40%. So that's a story that needs to be understood, and it's especially profound, I think, because the now 40-ish% of TANF cases that are child-only are about situations in which there is virtually no national policy, and it's unclear to me largely whether states think policy when they do the things they do that result in this caseload, or whether it's just sort of an after effect of other things going on. So even though there has been stability overall in the number of child-only cases for the last decade, that's really not the full story. The caseload trajectories have varied wildly from state to state. The distribution of cases among different kinds of child-only cases has changed somewhat. And at the end of our data collection period, we found that in 9 states, child-only cases were under 30% of the TANF caseload, but that went up to, in 5 states, over 70% of the caseload was child-only, which seemed really rather remarkable to, I think, all of us. And the question or the implications of this are really the subject of what I'm going to talk about, and I think Jane as well. So by way of background, TANF's role in the social safety net is rather diffuse. We talk about 4 kinds of caseloads: the adult-aided caseloads, those who presumably are on TANF benefits for a limited period of time and in theory are involved in or should be involved in welfare to work activities. The second group we call non-parental caregiver cases, cases in which children are being supported in kinship foster care or other kinds of arrangements in which children are living with kin. The third group that I'll be speaking about today is those in which the kids are receiving TANF benefits and the parent or parents are receiving SSI payments. And then the fourth group is, which was described by David, is that of the immigrant families. So the sort of orientation to my talk is that there really are key considerations for TANF, or there ought to be key considerations for TANF in serving these 4 distinct caseloads. And that the policy needs to be articulated for each type of case, and each type of case load size ought to be tracked and tracked separately and looked at and analyzed separately. In fact, that's been difficult to accomplish, and most data systems, both within the state and certainly federally, have been unable to meet that task. So we would say that policymakers should develop policy goals for child-only cases and calibrate their balance between child-only and adult-aided TANF cases. And that's really something I'm not going to say a whole lot about more, and maybe Jane will come back to it more. I want to get into the SSI cases before too much time elapses. So in the report, we talk about the relationship between the 3 child-only cases types of child-only cases that we discuss, and SSI disability, and the child welfare and foster care policies, and an immigration policy. The report provides cross-state and overtime analyses of the 4 types of TANF cases, including adult cases. And then we look in depth at 4 states, California, Florida, Illinois, and New York, where we have caseload counts by case type every 6 months for 5 years, interviews with state and county officials and advocates, and caseload and policy-focused survey data from TANF administrators. We also spent a fair amount of time on caseload counts for 5 years annually for 35 states from which we were able to retrieve that information, and national caseload data from the ACF. So looking at the focal states for a moment, you can see the states listed on the left: California, Florida, Illinois, and New York, and their share of the child-only cases the share of U.S. child-only cases that are in the focal state. So in California, it's 35%, Florida, 5%, New York, 8%, Illinois, 2% of the national caseload is in each of those states. And then the share of U.S. TANF cases overall that are in those states, and then finally the share of the U.S. poverty population in the focal state. So Just looking at California, not only because that's where I happen to reside, but because it's at the top of the list alphabetically, 35% of the child-only cases are in California, whereas 33% of the TANF cases are in California, so that's kind of fair, that's equal. But California is well overrepresenting in its TANF caseload the proportion of the poverty population in the country. And what's interesting that each of these 4 states has a very different pattern in this chart that I don't have time to go into. So I've talked about, or I mentioned at least, the notion of a triple burden that SSI-Parent child-only cases experience. And what is that triple burden? It's the burden of poverty, work incapacity, and disability. These caseloads are likely to stay long-term, both on SSI and on TANF child-only, perhaps until the youngest child in the family ages out of TANF. And during this period of time, it's quite likely that income really will not change. It's not likely that many of these folks are going to go to work, or if they go to work for a substantial bump up in income. So the notion of self-sufficiency, the notion of welfare to work, is really not very present in this group, although there is some effort among the Social Security Administration to work on SSI and work. The other important thing, and sort of the other side of the coin, is that even though there's this triple burden, adding SSI to a to a TANF caseload removes the adult's TANF benefit, but it gives them an SSI benefit. And it more than doubles the take-home income from these 2 sources. So that's really quite important. Nevertheless, folks are still typically stuck in poverty. So this is a table of some descriptive information of characteristics of the SSI-Parent child-only cases compared to adult-aided cases, child-only on the left, adult-aided on the right. And the 3 things that we're looking at here are the number of kids in the cases, not all that different either from state to state or from SSI child-only to adult-aided, so that's interesting in and of itself. But the next row down, the age of the primary adult, there is a profound difference between the SSI caseload and the adult-aided caseload, with the SSI parents being several, profoundly older, in part, no doubt, because they've been on the caseload longer, and once you're on the caseload and stay on longer, you tend to age, and that may be universal. And the other thing is that it may be that some of these folks got onto TANF a little later in life because of a disability problem that came later in life, although I don't think we really know much about that. And as a result of the older age of the parents, lo and behold, the kids are older as well. So, in fact, SSI parent child-only cases are more likely to receive TANF aid after 1, 2, or 5 years than are adult-aided cases. And again, if you look at California, just because it's right there, after 12 months, 83% of the SSI caseload remained. After 24 months, 78%. After 60 months, 58%. And if you compare that to the next set of California columns, you see how different that is from the adult-aided caseload retention rate. So with few SSI receiving parents able to work their way off TANF or SSI assistance, SSI child-only cases are more likely still to receive TANF after 1, 2, or 5 years than are adult-aided IIP or child-only TANF cases, IIP or the immigrant cases. 12 months later, across the 4 states, compared to adult-aided cases, an additional 33% of SSI parent cases remained on aid. 24 months later, the differential was 35%, and after 60 months, it was 28%. We employed an estimation strategy to determine the take-up rate of SSI parent child-only TANF cases among eligible SSI parents. This slide details some of the factors that went into it, but what I want to say is sort of I guess it's the middle bullet, that nationwide 13 to 14% of SSI parents would receive child-only TANF if they applied. The others are married or they're co-parenting with another adult who does not receive SSI, so they're not in this category, and or the family income is over the SSI eligibility threshold. And my time is running low, so let me talk faster. The take-up rate varies across states, but it depends on several factors. One is how many people are on TANF as adults and then find that they're disabled or get categorized as disabled and move to SSI. But it also depends on the number of people who were on SSI first and then either have a child or find that there is something called TANF for which their child might be eligible. So these are factors that need to be considered, as well as the SSI take-up rate overall, and what are the barriers to TANF in a particular state? How easy is it to get a hold of this thing called TANF? This is a ridiculously complicated graph to look at, but I love the shape, and the message is really quite interesting. This is a picture of, if you look at the blue, I think it is, it's the take-up of TANF child-only cases among SSI parents. Overall, across the country, it's about 25%. In California, which is, I don't remember, the third or fourth state down, it's about 50% rate, double the national average. New York State, so I'm repeating the figures for our focal states. New York State, it's 40%, Illinois about 30%, Florida about 20%. So profound differences within states in what the take-up rate is. What's going on? What's the message? Well, part of it is proportionally more SSI child-only cases are found in states that have larger adult-aided caseloads and that aim to identify disabled parents and support them in applying for SSI. It's sort of a no-brainer. It's a complicated relationship, and I'm going to say more about this on the next few slides. One of the factors is what's the value of TANF? This slide looks at the take-up rate in the far right column, depending on the benefit level for a one-child grant in a child-only TANF SSI parent case. And what you see is that in the top two rows, it's about 25% of the take-up rate is about 25%, and these are the states that have the lower benefit amounts. But on the bottom two rows, it jumps up to 40%. So that's a rather remarkable difference that seems to be associated with the value of the TANF grant for a one-child case. I think I'm going to skip this slide and go to this one, which looks at the percent of adult-aided TANF cases that transition to SSI-Parent child-only from the data we collected at 12, 24, and 60 months. And what you see is that there's one state that looks different from the other three. That's the state in red, which happens to be New York, has a much higher transition rate, and lo and behold, it's one of the states that actually makes transition a state policy or a state priority. So this slide says there are two things going on. Is there a statewide program to transition folks from TANF to SSI? And the other is what's the benefit level? And that goes into our understanding of the four focal states. But I wanted to sort of come towards the end of my talk by mentioning the first of three overview finding slides. And this one's on enrollment. Child-only TANF, like adult-aided TANF, is underutilized. Many eligible children could benefit from the additional income. Many SSI-eligible disabled parents are not enrolled in SSI, maybe they're part of TANF cases, and many SSI-receiving parents have not enrolled their children in child-only TANF. So in total, only 28% of the TANF-eligible children of SSI-receiving parents are estimated to be enrolled in child-only TANF. And one of the other things that's going on is that in states with short lifetime limits for TANF and strict work requirements, many disabled parents never enter TANF, or if they do, they're not there long enough to transition to SSI to perhaps get the support that the state or the county might provide. So that's an important factor. But what about the children's and the parents' needs? Really, considerations that are attended to neither by TANF nor by SSI programs for this population. From other work that Jane and I have done, we know that children and their disabled parents would benefit from high-quality childcare, housing assistance, and consistent mental health services. From our TANF administrators survey, we also know that administrators at least think that these families would benefit from additional health care supports, respite care, funds for children's educational expenses and transportation. But the TANF programs are not designed to provide the service enrichment that could assist children of SSI-disabled, SSI-receiving parents, rather. So I think this is the last slide I'm going to try to say anything about, and that's, well, what is going on? What are possible goals, policy goals that could be either going on or could be considered in this realm? One is that we should try to maximize the protection for children, a concept that was central to Jack Schoenkauf's plenary on the developing child the other day. And here you would want to support TANF enrollment of children of SSI receiving parents to help maintain income and supports and so on. Another priority might be to support transitions to employment for parents, something that the Social Security Administration does tend to and is really not tended to, I think, in most states for TANF SSI-Parent recipients. Another possibility might be to expand a national policy consistency around SSI. Maybe we should move towards a minimum level of support for children for disabled parents, perhaps by amending the SSI program to include support for dependents. And then a final policy option, frankly not my favorite, is to keep caseloads low, serve only the neediest, let the SSI cases take over a larger and larger percent of the TANF caseload. So I leave you with those things to reflect on, and I will give it back to David. Do you want to interchange? Or my colleague Jane Mulden from the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Policy.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. And this is a discussion of the section of our report that focuses on non-parent caregiver, child-only cases. Before I begin, I just want to make a couple of thanks as well. The work was funded by ASPE and OPRE, and for that we continue to be appreciative. And it was at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago where the project was located, and Matt Stagner is a co-author on the report, although he is no longer at Chapin Hall. But we also benefited from people who read and reviewed the report: Randy Capps, Mike Wiseman, Pam Lopres, David Stevenson, Don Winstead, and I note them because the report was long and their comments very thoughtful and helpful. So I just want to say that. Thank you. So the motivation for my talk is to understand state variation in non-parent child-only caseloads. By state variation, I mean variation both in the percent of state TANF caseloads that are non-parent caregiver and in the percent of potentially eligible children in a state that are enrolled in non-parent caregiver cases. So I want to discuss whether the current variation in caseloads can be understood as a result of changes in the last decade and divergences in state policy or state practice or state caseloads anyway in the last 10 years. And I also want to look at the links between TANF and NPC and child welfare. The non-parent caregiver caseload is the largest portion of the child-only caseload. And the range in terms of the share that is non-parent caregiver, however, ranges from 5% at one state to more than 80% in another state. So that range is absolutely huge. Why do we mind? Why does it matter about the changes and the variation in the share of the caseload that is non-parent caregiver? Well, one way to think about it is that spending from the TANF block grant is zero-sum. So to the extent that child-only cases, or non-parent caregivers in particular, are a growing or a large share of the caseload, that necessarily means that some other portion of the caseload, probably adult-aided cases, are a smaller share of the caseload and are in some way crowded out, at least from the zero-sum piece of the TANF spending. The other important element is to understand not only from a kind of fiscal standpoint the relationship with child welfare, but the implications for child well-being in the needs of children who have been removed from their homes, a particularly vulnerable group. So non-parent caregiver child-only TANF it's for households in which there is a non-parent relative caregiver. And to help you think about this, I'd like to tell you a story about how one family, let's say, has used non-parent caregiver TANF. So let's think about a family that in 1989 in California, a 16-year-old named Kate gave birth to a daughter, Dawn. That was in 1989, and a few years later she had a son, John. And Kate applied for and received AFDC, and with her benefit and her food stamps, she could, with some difficulty, rent an apartment and raise her kids. She got a little help here and there from friends, family. So she was raising 2 children. Then in 1998, Child Protective Services got a call that Kate's boyfriend was molesting the daughter. They did not find a basis for removal, but an aunt got wind of this, and she intervened and she took Dawn to live with her, and she left the toddler John with his mother. So 5 years later, Kate timed out of TANF, sorry, that was in 1998. So 5 years later, Kate timed out of TANF for herself, and in almost all states, she and John would both have exited or timed out of TANF. And indeed, Dawn would have as well, had she still been living with her mother. However, Dawn was living with her aunt, and that was a very challenged relationship because Dawn had carried the trauma of the abuse and the neglect that she had experienced. She continued to live with her aunt until she aged out at the age of 18. So she remained on TANF for her entire childhood, and her non-parent caregiver relative received that benefit. And when she was 17, she had a baby, and her aunt took on the baby. Dawn became a very disconnected youth. She moved out of the house, and the aunt received child-only TANF for the baby. Now, Dawn would have, in fact, liked to have had her own child with her, but she couldn't because the TANF benefit was far from sufficient to help her establish her own home. So for her, in her situation, her child did not live with Auntie because there had been evidence of a neglect. It was just simply that Dawn could not figure out how to manage or set up her own household, given the levels of assistance, and this was during the recession. Finally, this year, Dawn landed a minimum wage job, and almost immediately child support started attaching her wages and has been taking out almost half of her paycheck. She has not figured out how to get that modified, so she is set on quitting her job because she doesn't think it's worth doing. And Dawn, meanwhile, Aunt, meanwhile, is nearly 60. She has relied on TANF as part of her budget for many years, having received it for Dawn and now for Dawn's son. So that is there are no typical child-only uses, but I think that's one way to think about how a family, in this context of limited TANF benefits for adult-aided cases, might use a child-only non-parent caregiver TANF. So to summarize, you can say that NPC aid supports children in family-arranged care who have never been touched by child protection, but it also supports children who have been touched by child protection services but then diverted from foster care. It also has served children who have been former foster care, as well as current foster care children. And whether they are currently in foster care depends a lot on the setup of the 4E foster care funding program. NPC is the default payment available to kin caregivers if they don't get the 4E foster care payment. And for a 4E foster care payment in most states, 3 conditions must be met. Some of these are true of all states. First of all, the child must be the ward of the court. Second of all, the child must be 4E eligible. And third of all, the kin caregiver must be licensed at a level in a way that entitles them to a foster care payment. And many, many states have various kinds of waivers or entirely separate licensing systems for kin, and that often means that the kin is not eligible for a foster care payment and is not also the child who will not be eligible for kin gap under fostering connections either. So the NPC TANF continues to play a really important role in these kinds of settings. There's a typo on the slide, by the way. It's the 1996 eligibility rules, not 1994. But it's a look-back rule that is making it increasingly difficult for children to qualify for 4E foster care subsidy, because the look back becomes increasingly irrelevant in a way, or less inclusive. So I've made these points. TANF, a number of states are setting up formal kinship care programs. And often these, in some cases I know for sure these are funded by TANF and regarded as TANF cash assistance, and I'm not sure about other states. The kinship care benefit is often higher than regular TANF, but lower than the foster care payment, and it is paid per child, whereas TANF is not. For example, Florida's non-parent caregiver TANF benefit for 2 children is $241, but their relative care program, their kinship care program, depending on the ages of the children, for 2 children will pay about at least double that, $484 to $596. Now, this is considerably lower than the per capita payment under the foster care system, but it's a substantial increment over the non-parent caregiver TANF benefit. In Florida, each single child within a non-parent caregiver kinship care case is counted as a non-parent caregiver TANF case. So and I don't know if that's true in the other states that are setting up these programs. But the ambiguity, 2 of those states could not be included in the study that Richard discussed because there was inconsistency in the sizes of the NPC caseloads depending on where the numbers were being reported from. And it made me think that different administrators counted things in different ways. I'm not talking about mistakes in sort of legal reporting. I'm talking about responses to surveys that we conducted and so forth, where caseloads varied really wildly in different circumstances. So I think there's ambiguity in terms of how those kids are counted. So I've already made the point that they're the largest group. That's the tall blue bar, and they're coming down. So why did they fall? So one reason that they might have fallen is that there were fewer kids who were reliant on non-parent caregiver money for post-foster care, that kin gap programs and adoption assistance programs stepped in as children moved out of foster care, and those kids are no longer being supported by NPC TANF, but other sources of funds. This makes the point with the red bars that I already made, that from 5% to 80% of state TANF caseloads can be in red, which is non-parent caregiver. So why do some states have such high shares of non-parent caregiver? Well, I already suggested that there may be some crowding out, and indeed, there is a statistical correlation that is quite strong, where the percent of children living with poor parents in low-income parent-present families, poor parent-parent families, is negatively correlated with the share of the TANF caseload that is comprised of non-parent caregiver cases. So the y-axis shows the red piece that crowds from 5 to 80%, and the x-axis shows the percent of a state's poverty population of children with parents that is enrolled in TANF, which ranges from 3% to somewhere in the region of, 50%. I wanted to say 50%, and that is. A second hypothesis is that there may be high enrollment among children in non-parent caregiver cases. These cases are not means tested in almost all states, and in a sense, in theory, all non-parent caregiver could enroll the children they're caring for in TANF. The child support collection process is certainly a very strong disincentive, but the ratio, the 50-100 or 103 to 100 or 76 to 100, that refers to the ratio of children, the count of children in non-parent caregiver households to the number of children in the children in TANF-supported non-parent caregiver households to the number of children in poor non-parent settings in a state. So in the top row, which has 12 states in it, the average state enrolls half of their children about half of the size of the non-parent caregiver child caseload is about half the size of the children who are in poverty non-parent caregiver homes. In the second row, the size of the children in non-parent caregiver households is larger than the number of children in poverty non-parent caregiver homes. And in the third row, the ratio is about 76 to 100. The third row is are the states where the coverage of children in parent-present households is extremely low. In those states, only 6% of children in impoverished parent-present households are enrolled in TANF. But the point in this slide is that not only are some states providing non-parent caregiver TANF assistance to actually a larger number of households than are poor in that status, but that there is no direct correlation between the size of the non-parent caregiver caseload and the fraction of potentially eligible households that they are covering. So that second theory about the reasons for variation is not borne out. And the third is that it might be that some of the states with the largest caseloads now are the ones which have seen the largest growth. And that actually is also true, turns out to be true. States that lost the child-only cases also had smaller shares of caseloads in non-parent caregiver cases in 2010, but 1/3 of states actually gained non-parent caregiver cases. 1/3 of states went in a direction that was contrary to the national trend and actually increased their non-parent caregiver caseloads between 2002 and 2010. And they, to a substantial degree, account for the the states that have very large shares now. So those are the main points that I want to make. I want to also just close with a quick point about New York, which illustrates, the state of New York helps illustrate how it is that even within a state, different jurisdictions can allocate children between foster care and non-parent caregiver arrangements in very, very different ways. So New York City, looking at per 1,000 children of the population, New York City has about equal numbers of children who are with relatives receiving non-parent caregiver TANF as they do of children who are with relatives in full family TANF in non-parent caregiver homes. That is to say, the non-parent caregiver qualifies for an adult benefit. And they also have about, the third branch of that is children in 4E foster care with kin, and those three groups are of roughly equal size in New York City. So they are overall about 8 children per 1,000 are in one of those relative caregiver settings. In New York State, outside of New York City, there are 20 times more children in non-parent caregiver TANF as there are in foster care. Now, we don't know in either case whether the children in the non-parent caregiver settings are, in fact, placed there by the court. What is very striking here is that the prevalence of 4E foster care outside of New York City is so low, and the prevalence of non-parent caregiver TANF is more than twice as high. It's quite suggestive of variation in practices with regard to how the funds are made available to caregivers for court-placed children. So overall, I focused on the caseload issues already, but I want to just note on, with regard to child protection, that it appears that TANF-funded kinship care programs are growing within states and across states, and in some states, TANF-funded kinship care is counted as NPC TANF cases, and in the states may prefer to fund post-foster care placements with NPC-funded kinship care rather than with fostering care connections, KinGAP, in part because that latter program requires eligibility for 4E. Just wanted to mention that you can Google the report, you can put TANF Child Only, Chapin Hall, or TANF Child Only, one of the names of the authors, and that will find it for you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Todd Bland from California, and I am not a researcher. I am currently I am the TANF director and the SNAP director for the state. Most of my talk today is going to be about how California is different, why California is special. It's been great watching the other two presentations, and now I feel a little bit better about the fact that I'm always confused about how we count child-only cases, and because it always confuses me. So now I'm going to add to your confusion, because I'm going to sort of take you through the California way of thinking about it. I'll try to translate along the way kind of a little bit more about the way the national looks at it. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the CALWORKS program, which is our TANF program. I'm going to talk a little bit about the caseload trends, both for child-only and what we'll call the safety net, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. And there's finally some value-added slides at the very end about actual stuff about differences between the child-only cases. So first of all, I want to just backgrounding us. We are a state-supervised, county-administered program with 58 counties. We have about 570,000 cases, and about 1.4 million individuals are being served in those cases, and that's as of February. Here's a pie chart. Most of the cases in California, most of the aided individuals in California indeed are children. I have a hunch but don't know. This might be a little higher than the national average because we, as we'll be talking about in a moment, have various policies that essentially create child-only cases more than might be in the case in other states. This slide talks a little bit, let me talk about the first point. This is another way I think of reflecting. Richard had a slide that showed the share, I believe, of poverty, about 13%, but the share of the TANF cases was about 33% in California. This is sort of another, the first bullet is another way of saying that we're serving about 55% of the children in poverty. That would be under the old measure, and I believe this is from 2010, it might be 11. But the national average is much lower, so I think this is actually looking at the same data in a slightly different way. California is one of 8 states with a safety net program where the adult time's out, but the children continue to receive aid. Originally that was 5 years, it's now 4 years. And generally in the national parlance, these wouldn't count as child-only cases. And as you'll see in some of our data, we track them separately, but I think of them as a child-only case because we no longer have an aided adult. We also take a similar policy with respect to sanction. We do not have a full family sanction. If an adult is not compliant with our requirements, whatever those might be, we would remove the adult, but we would continue to compute aid for the children in the household. This is I believe this is the overall caseload. This is the ethnic breakdown according to our survey data. It is, I don't believe it's the child only, it's the overall. And obviously the largest group in California, Hispanic population is the Latino population is the largest group. This is just a little bit of context in California, sort of, and the economy. The blue line would be the unemployment rate. Going back to the early 90s and tracking it through the Great Recession. And the orange line is our caseload. Obviously the scales are different. One is a percentage and the other is the absolute. And you can sort of see there's kind of 3 periods. There's the sort of the period where that lasts till about 01, where the essentially decline, the improving unemployment rate kind of coincided with a little bit of a lag with a substantial reduction in the in our caseload. At the same time, we implemented federally the TANF program and CALWORKS in California. Then you see that sort of middle period where there's a spike up in unemployment, although not a huge one, and there wasn't much response in our caseload. I'm not sure anyone's ever exactly figured out why. There was some thought that in California that recession was more about the tech industry and perhaps didn't affect retail and some of the places perhaps where CALWORKS or TANF clients were working, but we're not 100% sure why that may be. And then in the final section, we see the huge spike in unemployment. I believe California maybe reached the second highest unemployment rate in the nation and is still very, very high, although starting to come down. And you see that our caseload did go up, and we think that that's the appropriate policy response of a safety net program, of a CalWORKS program to aid people when they're unemployed and the economy is giving them difficult times. You do see as unemployment came down, our caseload did start to fall. I'll talk about some of that is also a policy change we made. This is sort of two snapshots, two pie graphs, and let me tell you about the categories here. So on the left, well, the 34%, which on the left side there, looking at it my left, child only, those would be cases where we don't have an aided adult. That would be SSI parents. Those would be we call them non-needy caretaker relatives, but it's very similar to what was being described. It would not be what we call our safety net. The safety net is, again, that timed out group. And in March 2003, that's only 3%. It's a very small group. That's because that was just the very beginnings. We started that clock, that 5-year clock, in 1998. So 2003 would have been the very beginning of that. TANF timed out is essentially families that have reached the end of their federal clock and therefore are not eligible for federal funding. I believe there's actually a 20% hardship thing, but for simplicity, we fund them out of state-only MOE dollars. But essentially, there are various things that might stop your clock in California. We might continue to aid you, aid the adult, even though the feds would not want to participate in that with the TANF dollars. So the TANF timed out is sort of what happens before you become safety net. And then you can see our 1-parent and 2-parent caseloads. And as you compare across the pies, you see that the child-only percent has stayed about the same. Oh, and obviously another huge part of our child-only percent is the ineligible immigrant parents. And you can see that share stayed the same, but the safety net, which makes sense. We go 10 years later, and we've had more families, time on aid, would reach that. Let me say one thing about the safety net that's very interesting. We do not run the clock when a family is non-compliant. If the adult is non-compliant, we would sanction and just remove the adult. But since the adult is not being aided in that sanction, there is no clock to run. They're not being aided, so we're not running their clock. So I always find our safety net kind of as an interesting group in that they were compliant enough with our policies that they didn't get sanctioned, which means they probably had income. We have a fairly generous earned income disregard, so some of them indeed might have been those mixing kind of work and welfare at a level perhaps earning maybe $1,000, $1,100, $1,200, $1,300 a month. Family of 3, they could still be on aid. Others may have maybe not been quite that successful, but were successful enough or doing enough to not get sanctioned. Maybe they end up at we have a conciliation process and a due process, so it takes a while to actually sanction a family. Here's a closer look at sort of some of these trends more recently. I think the point I would make about this is that the top line is that is the blue line. It's harder to see up here. That's the 1-parent at the top. And then the red line is the child only. I think except for back in 2007, sort of their trends were more or less running together. And then that line curving up at the bottom, that is the safety net, which again, I think the logic of as time moves on that would grow makes sense. We have a couple new policies. We're going to move to an annual reporting system for our child-only cases. Actually, we did move to the annual reporting in October of 12. And we're going to be moving to a semi-annual reporting every 6-month system from our quarterly system for all of our cases. Yeah, this maybe on this slide I can translate a little bit more. This is kind of the clearer definition of what makes up what we call child only. If you went to one of our websites and saw one of our displays where they break the caseload down, so it would include ineligible felons. Some of those are drug felons. Some of those are people in violation of parole. It includes what we call the non-needy caretaker relatives, which is analogous to the non-parent caregivers. It would include the SSI parents, and it would include the parents with an undocumented immigration status, which is, again, generally analogous. So that's sort of the translation. This is looking at that group of just the child-onlys in a pie graph, essentially with the largest being the undocumented parents. Would have been interesting to see an earlier snapshot of this one. I'll see if my staff can put that together next time. This chart, again, looks at trends, shows how the undocumented went up substantially from 2007 through about 2010, then leveled off. Safety net, of course, continuing to grow. And SSI parents, fairly flat, slightly declining. Those are the recent trends there. I won't say much about the ineligible felons. They went up a lot. In fact, if you go back one, I won't go back. I'll try to move on for time. But they're still a relatively small portion of the overall caseload. On the non-needy caretaker relatives, California, I think, as was pointed out in some of the other presentations, we don't really have much of a state policy in terms of providing assistance. Wait a second. Sorry, I'm switching off. That's SSI. Yeah, I think the point we would make here is some of our non-needy parents are perhaps being aided, or our numbers might even look a little bit different. Moving to the SSI slide, and I think the second bullet is a little confusing, and probably we'll change it. If you're an SSI parent, you wouldn't be aided, but we do have people who are not disabled enough to be on SSI who are on the caseload, and I think that's a place where, again, we could do, potentially the state could be doing more for transitions there. We tend to leave that to the counties. I believe Los Angeles County, there's going to be a presentation later today about some of their initiatives there. Just a couple points about the undocumented parent cases. In California, we actually aid recent non-citizen immigrants, we call them. Essentially, those are legal non-citizens, and we aid the adult there. And we're not sure exactly how other states treat them, but potentially if we didn't aid them, they would essentially be showing up as a child only, but they don't. They don't in California because we do have that aid. That's essentially with state maintenance of effort dollars. They're federally ineligible for federal funds, but they are eligible for the program. We can fund them with maintenance of effort, and we do. Yeah, we made a recent change in our safety net. We moved from 60 months to 48 months, and in one of the earlier charts, it showed there was actually a drop-off in July of 2011 when we made that change. And you might think, well, why did it drop off? Because you would have dropped the adult, but not the case, because the case would continue to be aided. And the reason is essentially under our disregard, the exit point for that family fell. So those were actually families getting relatively low grants through the disregard because we removed the base amount of the grant, the exit point went down, and so some of them exited. So some of those exits were due to income and a lower grant. And when families exit our program, they are eligible for child care assistance. It's an entitlement for 2 years, and it can go on past that. Generally does go on past that, although it's not an entitlement. Finally, a chart that sort of compares what's going on in child-only cases to safety net and to the one-parent and the two-parent cases. I'll just make a couple points about this. First of all, it is based on survey data, so we're extrapolating from somewhat small samples here, so I want to be a little bit careful. But I think what I find is very interesting is that the undocumented group, they had their time on aid was actually shorter than the other cases, and substantial number of cases reporting with earnings. We didn't run the percent there, but if you take that 32,000 and divide it into the 124,000 total, or almost 125, that's about a quarter. And again, and these would be parents who might indeed be working under the table and might not be reporting, so it might have even been different. I think it's interesting. It does sort of bear out the picture that a lot of those immigrant families are indeed working. That appears to be why they're here. That pretty much concludes it. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all very much. All three of those were great. We'd now like to open up a question and answer session for about 10 minutes, and there are two microphones in the middle here. Please be unabashed and flocking to those. And also, it's possible we may have some live stream questions. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure if it's still possible to submit a question via live stream, but I challenge you to try to do so if you're following online. Yes, right here.
Yes, John Shimano with the National Foster Care Coalition. I guess two kind of separate questions. One is on the SSI. I think you mentioned that there's underqualified parents out there, and I just wondered if you looked back at the old AFDC days when there was kind of an incentive for states to try and qualify a parent for SSI because it actually increased the income coming into the family, and it saved the state something because AFDC was a matching program and it reduced the AFDC grant. So if you saw any differences there. My other kind of separate question is on the kinship care, where you said there were three differences, basically. One, you had, if you were in the 4E system or the child welfare system, you were had to be a ward of the state, also had to go through licensing, but you also said 4E eligible. And I was curious about that. If states are pushing those non-4E eligible kinship families into TANF, because the way it works under foster care is whether the child is 4E eligible or not, they're getting covered by foster care. Either the state's picking up the full cost or they're getting the 4E match. So.
I actually couldn't understand the SSI question. The acoustics in here are terrible. Can you try it again?
It was the question, I think you indicated that there are a number of parents who are kind of basically underserved. They aren't being qualified for SSI even though they are eligible. And I guess what I was asking is if you look back in the AFDC days, where states could save money actually by going out and making the parent eligible for SSI because it reduced the AFDC grant, which saved the state some matching funds, and it also helped the family because the total amount of money coming into the family was going up. And so I wonder if you've seen a change in that incentive.
I don't have overtime information on that question, and it really is more, I think, a question of what may be the motivation of states either to do something or not to do something in terms of supporting the transitions. I actually would ask Todd if he has thoughts about this. One of the questions I've raised a number of times of administrators is, so where does the work participation rate come into this? Is there some motivation to get these cases off of the adult-aided caseload onto SSI? I would think that would help. And typical response is sort of a scratching of the head, like people really hadn't thought about that. Do you want to add to that, Todd?
There we go. Yeah, it would strike me the incentive would actually be even greater now. Under a matching program, costs and savings were shared, but in a block grant program on the margin, the state bears all the costs or all the savings. So I would think the incentive would be even greater, and I think it does point out sort of the lack of sort of forward-thinking policy about it, that essentially California has devolved the decision about whether to provide kind of assistance for aided parents who might be able to transition. We've kind of devolved that to our counties.
I'll just add a couple of things. Mike Wiseman and Steve Wemhoff have a useful paper that found an increase in transitions over a longer period of time from the FDC to the TANF period. One reason that the transitions may be depressed is if a state has a low adult-aided caseload or has a relatively short time limit, adults may not either access TANF at all or may not remain on TANF long enough to be able to sort of be identified as disabled and make that transition. So the compression of the adult-aided caseload has implications for the SSI transitional process. You had a question about kin caregivers and 4E. I think there's variation in the extent to which states make efforts to establish 4E eligibility for children. That's one thing. Because, in fact, it requires efforts on the part of social workers to establish that eligibility with respect to the 96 TANF, AFDC criteria. I don't think they're pushing children into, I have no reason to say there's any pushing of children into NPC TANF. On the other hand, there are really wide variations, as I briefly went over with respect to the intrastate variation in New York. And there are, you know, if there's a kinship care program, especially if it pays more than NPC TANF and indeed may be counted as NPC TANF in the caseloads, it may well be preferable to kin caregivers. It doesn't have the stigma, it doesn't have the supervision that is associated with foster care. So where the dynamic is in that choice or those options between foster care and NPC TANF is not clear, but there may be incentives on both sides.
I just wanted to check in if we had any live stream questions. All right, sir. Maybe try the other one.
Good morning. Whoa, excuse me. This one is on. My name is Jorge Lopez, and I work for the Torres Martinez Desert Cahuilla Indians for Tribal TANF. I have a comment and a question. The comment would be as I would challenge the panel that hopefully when we come back next year, there's some data that includes Native Americans throughout any presentations. That's just one comment, and maybe some research on that would be great. My question is to Dr. Malden, and is in regards, you made a comment that you could have non-parental child-only cases that are in fact needy cases, that are full cash aid cases for the adult and the child. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. And then second of all, to see if in fact that was the case and what the data looks like on those cases.
Well, I misspoke. You can have, because if you use the term NPC to mean a category of TANF, then by definition, it's not adult-aided. However, there are grandmother, auntie-headed cases without the capital NPC as a category, grandmother, auntie, and so forth, granddaddy, uncle-headed cases that receive adult-aided TANF if they are income eligible and willing to comply with program rules. Some states have modified their program rules with respect to work, especially for older caregivers and who are not actually parents. But this is so confusing, I have to say, because the term NPC is a category, and yet the relationship is non-parent and not necessarily into the category. Is that helpful? Just
it's helpful to add to the confusion, yes. You know, I'm like Mr. Bland says, the child only always, I'm the director of the program, and we debate it all the time on, and I looked at it as child only is a relationship question, income eligibility is an income question. But is there anything in the federal rules that would, or state rules, Mr. Bland, that would impose a rule that we could not make grandmother, just one child, not her child, a full case?
You can.
Okay. And then she would be exempt because of other rules that we could have because she's old or whatever, disabled. Now, but you can't have a non-relative a full case. I mean, I don't know if there's a rule against that or if you know, because for the tribe, what we try to do is keep our Indian children within the community, grandma, grandmother, auntie, aunt, but if not, neighbor. And so can we make them a full case?
Give that to the TANF administrator.
I want to say that that the tribes have more latitude there. They'd have to negotiate that with the federal government, but they would have more latitude to set up their programs under their block grant funds. That's my thought, but
I just want to caution that we're almost at our time limit, but I also don't want to misspeak, but I am fairly confident that there are some exceptions where a non-relative caretaker could be the head of a full unit. But
I think we can agree it's just confusing.
right. Anyways,
this is Emily Schmidt from OPRE. I just wanted to jump in on the first SSI question and say that OPRE actually has a research project that is devoted to that very question about the extent to which TANF eligible people are, people on the TANF caseload are potentially SSI eligible and what states are doing to perhaps try to move them to SSI. And the final results are being reported in this room at noon, and I don't know what they are, so I'll be here, and if you're interested, I encourage you to come. It'll also be on the live stream.
well, with that, let's conclude. Thank you all very much, and again, a huge thank you to our panelists.